Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, which is the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threat of gender identity ideology. The declaration will be, you'll find it on our website, which is womensdeclaration.com, and it's been signed by 36,110 people from 160 countries and is supported by 506 organisations. We have many volunteer activists and country contacts from every continent. And if you are a woman and support the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, please do consider joining us as a volunteer or as a donor or as our new potential being a member, which you'll find out about on the our website. Today, we are going to hear from three speakers. And so we have Laoise de Brún from the Countess, the organisation, brilliant organisation in Ireland. She's going to speak first, and she's going to give us an update on the situation in Ireland and the activities of the Countess. Then we're going to hear from Florence Waller from England. She's going to talk about single-sex spaces relating to home care provision. And then we're going to hear from Dansky, who is the president of the USA WDI chapter and author of a couple of books, and we'll talk about that when Cara comes on. Our first speaker is Laoise de Brún. She is a barrister at law in Ireland and CEO and the founder of the Countess, which is an Irish campaigning organisation and activist organisation working in Ireland on the threat posed by gender ideology. How are you, Laoise, and how's the organisation going, and how's Ireland?
Well, third year as an organisation. We launched in September 2020, so we're coming up to our third birthday. And we had been Zooming in secret prior to that, but that's when we kind of launched into the public sphere with a thread that went viral all around the world. And it was about the women in Limerick's prison and in the women's wing of Limerick's prison. And I'm really pleased to say that I'm here today with good news that we have managed to bring forward legislation to exclude the Gender Recognition Act, the Gender Recognition Certificate, from applying to prisons. So essentially, I've drafted that myself personally, and what I've done with it is quite minimalist, I hope, and hopefully elegant, and hopefully it will get through or get as far as it can, at least as a messaging bill. But what we've done is we've said that it will no longer change whether a person is male or female when it comes to prisons. So therefore, we are limiting the scope of what a gender recognition certificate can do. And we intend to bring forward more and more legislation in order to chip away at a gender recognition certificate, because we at the Countess have long seen a gender recognition certificate really as an access all area pass for predators, transgressors, sports cheats, and perverts. And so even though this is not repealing the GRA, I have to say from the outset that, you know, of course I would love to repeal the GRA. I don't know an activist who wouldn't. This is simply as a matter of urgency and really as an emergency. We need to get those men out of the women's prison. So this is what we're doing. This is what we feel that we can achieve. And I'm really happy to say that, you know, we are, it's looking really good to get the 10 signatures that we need on our amendment bill to force a debate in Parliament in Ireland, which we've never had. No one has ever had to defend to their constituents the fact that men, dangerous sexual predators, are being placed in the female estate, in the reversal really of a 200-year-old policy. Because, you know, it was in 1723 that Elizabeth Fry and other reformers brought in legislation, advocated for legislation to separate the sexes in prison, explicitly to protect female prisoners from male prisoners. And so self-ID essentially reverses a 200-year-old policy. So we'll be asking our opponents to justify that and to justify the placing of these men in the women's wing. You know, recent revelations have shown the very egregious psychological impact on the women who, as we know, after all, you know, criminologists will often talk about the, you know, male violence being, in fact, the pathway to incarceration for female prisoners. So, they've had a lifetime of male violence and abuse, and they are 95% of them are non-violent. They're in for petty crimes of addiction and coercive control, theft and non-violent crimes, and 85% of them are mothers. So we feel as an advocacy group, essentially I feel as the founder that this is really the thing that made me say I have to do something. And it was the plight of those women that affected us to kind of an emotional level as an organization, and that's why we have done what we've done. So I'm happy to start off with very good news.
I mean, that's fantastic. And can you tell us how that worked, the process, the drafting of the legislation, when you started doing that, and how you've been able to get in touch with politicians who are pushing it in?
Yes. So I think what I'll try and explain is really the building blocks to get to that stage for any activist group. So I think, we were lucky insofar as next door, including yourselves, there's just such a great example of amazing organizing amongst feminists. And so, I was, from the very outset, I was kind of building peer-to-peer relationships with other leaders and getting advice. And one of the things that I decided to do from the outset was to really exercise a discipline around how we behaved online and in real life, to be extremely disciplined in our messaging, in our optics, in the information that we put out there. Because this is, after all, an information war. But also, if you scope, as we did, really hard at the beginning, and decide that you want to become a stakeholder group, that you never again want policies to be made and laws to be brought in that impact women and children in the way that Self-ID has done, and all the other accompanying suite of bills, which I'll explain about in a moment. But we want to be the ones with our feet under the table in future. So in order do that, there's a sort of number of steps that you have to go through in order to see. And we're kind of ranted online. We don't talk about personality. Is immense. We do all the consultations, and we do them to a degree of excellence. And even in terms of our content on social media, I see this very much as an information war. So I think that it's important to be putting out really good fact-checked content all the time, and we do that across 6 different social media platforms now. And I run it like a newsroom. I'm a former broadcast journalist, so nothing we ever put out will ever go out that we can't stand up ourselves. And in that regard, then I think we've built the trust of policymakers, because even when they say nothing and you're out in the cold and you're, the outsiders and the pariahs, and you're, as we were, smeared as one TD infamously called us a fringe group of far-right transphobes from the floor of our parliament, so abusing his absolute privilege. But the thing is, we've just kept going. We've kept the work ethic and the output. And I think that's what gets noticed, and all the consultations. And then you think, gosh, the consultations are such hard work, and you scramble, and we're all just volunteers, and lots of us are mothers, and we're juggling households and jobs and caring responsibilities. But we've always managed to keep that level of work ethic and output going. And then eventually I think it percolates up. And so what happened was, we ran a poll 2 years ago, and I'm always keeping an eye out for kind of who starts to follow us, on the Twitter handle. And then I noticed the senator had followed us, and I was just jumped at the chance to sort of reach out to her and meet her for a coffee. And then we started working quite closely with her, and we started writing speeches for her. And then through her, other senators. And then gradually, then I had a meeting with a TD, 1 or 2 TDs, and one of them, I just pitched to him and just said, we need to amend the Gender Recognition Act. And also, I have to say, sometimes with this game, you make your own luck, as in your timing can turn out to be impeccable, but it's because you've been slugging away so hard for so long. And what happened was, because of Nicola Sturgeon being unable in that jurisdiction in Scotland to defend that policy when, a rapist was sent to a female jail in Scotland, and because she sort of dissembled in the media and then ultimately had to resign because of her inability to defend the indefensible, I just spotted my chance, and I started kind of messaging the TTs that I now had met by this stage and had a relationship with, and saying, our time is now, So it's about being a bit brass-necked, I think, but also having the discipline and the work ethic to get you there, to get you the access. And I have to say, it's always evolving. We're always learning. We're not seasoned campaigners in the Countess. I have no background in this. And so what I have found is that I'm now learning, as well, that with this game, when you finally get to that stage where you want to be, where you're going in, you're having meetings, you're in from the cold, you know, and you've got the ear of elected representatives, of TDs, or, you know, in our country, or MPs they'd be called in the UK. So what happens then is you realize that even though you have the access, you're in a power relation, insofar as, you know, once you hand over your idea, it's their idea to run with, because they are fitting it into their own agenda, and they have their own relationships with their colleagues inside. But what they have, which you do not have, is they are inside the chamber. They're inside the chamber and you're on the outside. And actually, it can be sort of a hard pill to swallow sometimes, and you have to get on with it, because you have more expertise than them. You know, your matter, your cause is only one of, you know, so many on their plate. And so it's really about that sort of nimble, deft and intuitive, and I guess having the emotional intelligence to quickly learn on your feet that that's the case, you know, and not be triggered, because it can be triggering, because you're like, this is your baby and this might be a culmination of 3 years work. So I think they're the key things to build up that credibility and reputation for excellence and for discipline. And then once you build those relationships, to remember and remind yourself that, you know, they're the ones inside the chamber and you're not. But yeah, I mean, we are at a very much a tipping point in Ireland, and I think because of our work on the ground, the genie's out of the bottle, and Irish people are talking about this in real life. And once that happens with gender ideology, you know, as we all know, it's like a house of cards. It has no intellectual, theoretical heart. Like, it doesn't stack up, any of it. So I can tell you for a fact that, like, parents in Ireland do not want the teenage daughter running the gauntlet in a mixed-sex school toilet or elsewhere. They don't want the daughter tackled in a football field by a boy. And so there is growing disquiet and even outrage, I would say, on the ground in Ireland.
And so it's interesting, because you're really sort of focusing on legislation and building that reputation, getting really good relationships, and also you being a lawyer and being able to draft legislation that can be used by members of parliament to make amendments. That really seems to work. But you've also got this getting the word out big time with these 6, can you tell us, 6 media platforms? Can you tell us which platforms they are and how you manage to keep on top of all of that? How, like, do you have a press team, or what happens? Is it hard work?
Oh, if only.
Yeah.
If only we had like a paid media manager, you know, we definitely would have broken through the kind of glass ceiling, and we'd be probably on the cover of the Irish Times, or, you know, on RT News once a week. But alas, no. We've tried to box really clever. Like, in terms of radio and TV, we've done one TV show. Our spokeswoman in sport did it. She was absolutely excellent. It was an absolute bear pit. They set loads of traps for her. She kept it cool. I had a little chat with her beforehand, and I was like, sometimes if it's a bear pit, you know, I didn't want to put her off either, but I was like, your audience is the people at home listening. It's not really the presenter. It's not really the panelists. If it's incredibly adversarial like that, it's keeping your cool and your calm and getting your message out. So I would sort of, I suppose, coach people a bit like that. We have a few spokeswomen now. I want to see more. But what we did, which has worked really well for us, is we've sort of tried to we don't ignore them, but the woke mainstream media are much harder to crack than the regional, local radio stations in Ireland. And in Ireland, just the way the market is in terms of radio, they have huge listenerships. And so they love us, you know, and we get a lot of coverage that way, and we're getting the message out that way. And in terms of social media, you know, social media was also always how we did it first. So we launched on Twitter. I was running Twitter on my own initially, and now we have another woman, Barbara Jane, who does it with me, and then a few others will step up. But increasingly, because of the structure internally of the organization, we have kind of silos of expertise. So we have 8 pillars of concern, because when we scoped early on, we scoped very, very hard, and I was really keen to do that. And it's also really just enjoyable creative process, I have to say, when you're building an organization. But we identified like 8 pillars where we see you know, the interfaces, so where sex matters. So obviously things like prison, sport, the transitioning of young people, schools and safeguarding, the lesbian erasure, and so like each of those will have a working group with a lead, and because they're like mini think tanks, they develop really good expertise in their own field. So increasingly I'll get them each to write a thread for the handle. And I think once you develop a good following in your handle, you need to keep that up all the time. People expect it. They want your commentary and analysis of all gender critical events. And also we comment with authority. I've always been very clear in this. We comment on male violence against women and girls, and we'll comment on porn, and we will expand in the future to doing more work around porn. But for now, we just don't have the bandwidth, but we intend to. But like we recently launched on TikTok, we're getting huge following on Instagram, and they're all different because they've all got different demographics. You know, Twitter is obviously the people who are into politics. It's like a newsletter, but then Instagram is very visual, and we get like, it's kind of, I feel like Instagram is often you know, new mums who've got a few seconds, and we really use it actually as a kind of radicalizing tool insofar as we really try and raise consciousness, and you can do that with you know, visually. And then Facebook is more, everyone's based in Ireland. It's more gentle space than Twitter, obviously. And people want to have a nice chat about the issues, but it's very much a community. And then obviously, yeah, the YouTube channel, everything we do, we put in our channel. We are going to relaunch our station soon again and create our own content. But because we're quite busy with media now, we just put all that up there and brand it. And we get a lot of, you know, nice comments from people saying, oh, thank you. And so we've sort of made this work for us, even though we have been really, you know, that we have been working within a media blackout, let's say. But despite that, we've used social media to our advantage and really cultivated different communities on all the different platforms. And, you know, and they are very different, and you get a feel for it after a while. And it's, you know, it's such a useful tool, I think, for activism to get our message out. Like, for example, recently I made a speech outside the Dáil, which is our parliament, against the hate crime legislation, which is about to come in. And I have to tell, like, everyone watching, you know, Ireland's going to bring in the most oppressive, authoritarian hate speech legislation in all of Europe. I mean, it's shocking what they're going to do. So within 48 hours, we were able to get together enough people to have a rally. I made a speech, and then we pumped that out over all our platforms. So even if you didn't get to be there on the day, like, you can feel part of it, and you can, you know, learn what we're trying to say and learn about, you know, through our advocacy, what's happening, because you certainly won't read about it, you know, in the papers of record in Ireland, or learn about it in the mainstream media, because you know, this is one of the issues I think we all face with trans orthodoxy. Like, essentially, I view the media as one of the pillars of this, as in they have helped it proliferate, because they have only ever kind of they haven't questioned the official narrative, and in fact they've just kind of bolstered it all this time. You know, we've had a very famous columnist in Ireland liken us to Putin, and you know, that's hate speech. But we made a complaint, it just went nowhere. So we've just tried to work outside those sort of systems, I suppose. But in terms of hate speech, just briefly to give you an outline of how bad it is. So it's sort of, yeah, I mean, it's it's kind of buckle up, because it's really bad. So essentially there's going to be two of the main pillars of any liberal democracy will be completely trampled on. The first being presumption of innocence with under a criminal charge, and the second being freedom of expression. And essentially, it will no longer be up to the state to prove that you are guilty. It'll be up to you to prove that you are innocent. So that's one extraordinary change. I mean, that's very unusual. There's only tiny few areas of law, like maybe fraud or sexual abuse images, where that's the case, you know, where there's a sort of procedure. You know, normally in Ireland, like a certain of our police highly regulated like that under statute. But in this instance, you know, any member of An Garda Síochána, which is our national police force, can just go to your property and they can demand all your passwords for all your devices, and they can seize all your devices. But one of the most extraordinary things about this legislation is that there's no definition for hate at all. So, and that's on purpose. And their stated goal as legislators, they've said this explicitly, is to get more prosecutions. And they're sort of saying essentially that, you know, in order to do that, they won't define hate. So you could be hauled before the police and not know why, what you've done wrong, what you've said wrong. Also, there's no need to actually incite hatred. So you could have images or a poster in your house or an image on your phone that you don't send or share, but just possession is enough. So that's almost like pre-crime or pre-Tó crime. And then one of our big issues as a campaigning group, a gender critical campaigning group, is that certain groups of society are being afforded protected status, and one of them is trans-identified people. Now, we should all view the debate around the conflict of rights as a bona fides debate that we all need to have in society. And I think it's no coincidence that it's just because of our work and other groups on the ground in Ireland that we're finally having this debate the way we should be, you know, out in the open. That suddenly this has been brought in to essentially, I think, enforce the ideology on the culture. I mean, I don't even think that's any kind of conspiracy. I think it's pretty obvious, because trans-identified people will have afforded, well, they'll be afforded protected status. Well, what that means is that one of them can say that, you know, what I'm saying is hate speech, and that's enough, because the test is subjective. It's their perceived sense of hate, of my speech being hateful.
Yeah. One of the things that we've heard about from Spain, but also from the European Union, is it's going across Europe, that organizations and media companies that allow this sort of thing, our ideas on their platform, can be fined hundreds of thousands of pounds for not clamping down on it. And that's incredibly chilling as well, because it means that the 6 platforms that you're promoting the ideas on could get shut down. And do you think that's part of it as well, that they're going to make it punishable, so the companies themselves will decide it's not worth a risk? Or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is very worrying, and I like, it's almost like this sounds really I honestly don't know how to play out. Like, well, all we can say is, when we look at other jurisdictions like England and Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Norway, ordinary men and women have had a knock on the door and have been hauled before the police and have been arrested and charged. Now, it seems really hard to get a conviction, and no wonder. I mean, the whole thing is just really a dog's dinner in terms of drafting. But I don't think that's the point, really. I think you're quite right. I think it's just to have a chilling effect on the debate, so that people, you know, are afraid to even say it in the first place, afraid to put that tweet out, afraid to say it. And like, then people will just self-censor, which is such a pity, because, you know, we are just at a stage in Ireland in particular where we've just turned that corner. You know, we did a Red C poll 2 years ago, and like, it was unequivocal that, and it was very heartening for us, because we were still in that stage where, you know, we were lambasted and smeared all the time as bigots and transphobes and TERFs, by public representatives as well, you know. But the poll results were so heartening, because it just showed very clearly, like all these polls do anywhere in the world, that our views, that a man can never become a woman can't become a man, no child is born in the wrong body, it's impossible to change sex, these are mainstream majority held views. So, you know, and also, and I would love to do the poll again, because I'd say our figures would be much better even than they were, because 2 years ago, this was only trickling into the consciousness in Ireland. But, you know, even then, only 17% of people in Ireland agreed with the falsification of birth certs without full genital surgery, which is effectively what we have. You know, it's full self-ID, obviously, you have a revised birth cert, it's called, and you don't, you know, in Ireland, you don't need to transition in any way. You don't need to even to intend to transition. There's nothing you need to do. Just fill out a form. By its very essence, there is no gatekeeping in with self-ID, and that's what we have in Ireland. But, you know, fewer than 1 in 5 people in Ireland supported that 2 years ago. So, you know, hate crime legislation is there to enforce this ideology, which is deeply unpopular, onto the public. And I see it as kind of a part of a jigsaw or a suite of bills that happens. So when activists get in self-ID, as they did in Ireland 8 years ago now, you know, it's only the beginning, actually, when you look back. You know, we can see now that it was really just a flag in the sand. And then there's been a really aggressive forward march since then. what we've seen now is that, you know, at the time, like activists would say things like, oh, we just need this one small bit of admin, this piece of paper to be who we really are, to live our true selves, live our true lives. And then, but also we were kind of told it's also the new forefront and paradigm of international human rights law, and it doesn't impact anyone else in society. But, you know, it came in Ireland. But what we know now is, and I see this as kind of, it's become part of a kind of a wider ecosystem of full, complete institutional and cultural public sector capture, including schools, including government. And what happens then is they start to pump out other pieces of legislation which copper fasten self-ID and the idea of gender ideology, trans ideology onto the culture. And they do that by essentially making dissent unlawful across all sectors. So, for example, anti-conversion therapies bill means that a therapist can no longer do their job properly when they're presented with a gender distressed or questioning child. They have to affirm that. Hate crime obviously makes any normal debate or statement of material reality around biological sex hate speech, because it's as perceived by the trans-identified person. And also in Ireland and elsewhere, they've immediately started to push to expand self-ID down to children, down to 16-year-olds, with or without parental consent. And also, which happened obviously in America under Biden, in his first 100 days, the idea that we must collapse the gender ground in our equality legislation. So for me, that's like second level self-ID, because in Ireland currently you have to fill out a form. Now, no questions will be asked. You could be on remand for rape in Ireland, but you still get you still have to fill out a form and you get your GRC. But if the gender ground is collapsed, as they're trying to do in Ireland, well, what it would mean is that you can just on a whim identify into that female-only space. You know, we saw that in parts of Australia and Canada where they inserted into their domestic human rights instruments. But in Ireland, what they're trying to do is collapse the gender ground, which is what Biden did in his executive order, which means that gender no longer means biological sex. It means it's expanded to include gender identity and expression, which renders it meaningless, because it no longer means that a service provider can discriminate on the basis of sex with regard to toilets or intimate spaces. And then you end up in a position where Darren Moranger is walking into the girls and women's area of the wee spa in downtown LA. But we're already seeing those impacts in Ireland, because I see self-ID as having a very dark and diffuse impact on society. It's not just the technical impact of the law, it's also the paradigm shift, you know, because there's such cultural capture that lobbyists, what happens is service providers, including schools and shops and things, they kind of go way beyond what the lobbyists are even asking them to do. And what they're asking them to do is, allow that boy who says he's a girl into the girls' toilets. But what they do is they just they basically get rid of the girls' toilets altogether and have mixed-sex toilets or changing rooms. So in Ireland, there's a store called Penny's, which is really famous with, really popular with younger girls, like 12 and 13 and 14-year-old girls. And, you know, men, they don't have girls' changing rooms anymore. And men are putting their phones underneath the curtains and recording that image and putting it up on Pornhub.
So we're now going to move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Florence Waller, and she is from England, UK. She works as a private carer for an elderly couple, but has worked for agencies, so care agencies, as well as in care home setting over the last 12 years. In January, having spoken about the necessity for same-sex care at a Let Women Speak event in Newcastle, she was assaulted by a trans rights activist. She's going to talk to us today and tell us about the necessity of single-sex care and the steady encroachment of blurred language and how it's affected the care industry. So Florence, thank you so much for coming and sharing what you know. This is a really crucial area, and to get your insight into what's happening will be really great. So tell us a bit about what's been happening and how you found out about it.
I used to work for agencies, and it's only in the past 5 or so years that I've been working privately. And I stayed in touch with someone that I knew who I cared for, who still relies on home care from an agency. And she was telling me what was happening and saying that they keep sending this bloke around to her house. And she's a very, as many people are, she's a very private person. Even with women doing her intimate care, she tries very hard to keep her dignity. She finds it really, really difficult to receive that care. It's not easy for her. So just hearing that they've been sending a man round was really shocking to me. She luckily has her husband at home, and he was able to help her on the days that this man was sent round, and they could just send him away. And also she's about 15 years older than me, and she used to be a carer herself. So she knows what her rights are, and she's able to advocate for herself. And this got me thinking, well, how many ladies on that, vulnerable elderly ladies with dementia are on that same route, and are having a man letting themselves into their home, and they can't speak out about it, and do their families know that this is happening? So that's really what started me thinking about it, and this was about 4 years ago, but when I worked for the company that used to look after this lady I'm talking about, there were no males on the books at all. So I was wondering where have all these men come from all of a sudden, and also now that I work this elderly couple, the lady that I'm looking after is sadly dying of lung cancer, and she's currently bedridden. And the NHS have coordinated a continuing care team provided by an outside provider to come in 4 times a day to assist with her care, because it's quite a lot for just me. And I've also got her husband to look after. So they come in, and they've sent, on no less than 10 occasions, they've been sending a man. So suddenly this problem I knew about, I was seeing it in the flesh and seeing what it did to a whole family. And it was really distressing. It not only really upset the lady I look after, but also her husband became really aggravated in defense of her. He's got COPD. So when he was trying to say, this is, I don't know, the umpteenth time you sent someone round, we said not to do this, he was getting increasingly frustrated. He's also got vascular dementia, which carries with it behavioural difficulties. And so he got himself so worked up that he was unable to breathe properly.
I was an au pair for a while, and I thought I was reasonably good as an au pair in Belgium, and I was learning French, but I really put my heart and soul into it. So I was looking after 2 kids, and I looked after them and helped them with their homework, took them for cycle rides, built a pond for them in their back garden, and engaged. And then I noticed, I mean, this was years ago, but there was some male au pairs. And I remember talking to one who was in a similar situation to me. He was looking after 2 kids. And I said, oh, what do you do in the day? And he said, oh, it's really good. The parents are out, so I don't have to do anything. And I don't look after the kids. I just carry on playing on my PlayStation. And I don't make them do their homework. And they just get their own food. And he basically just didn't engage with them. And I was so horrified and he felt like he could get away with it because the parents didn't really find out. And so I know that not all men are necessarily going to be irresponsible, but I'm thinking the more in today's culture where they have this position of just get what you can, and it's often to do with learnt masculinity, I can imagine care standards will go down and no one will know.
We don't know exactly what's happening behind closed doors because these are individuals' homes. So you don't have the CQC coming down on a care home looking at what's going on. You've got people with severe late stages dementia relying on home care, and we don't necessarily know what's happened. But what we do know was that within 3 months in 2018, there was nearly 1,000 allegations of sexual assault and incidents reported to the Health Watchdog. This is regarding care, 47 of which were rapes. So this is and this is just what's reported and what we do know. So introducing more males into the domiciliary care workforce is a strange a strange move, given that there is evidence that this is going on. So people are already not safe, and I don't see how it would make people feel much safer. And I have sort of had a cursory look at some numbers, which has been quite difficult to find, actually, believe it or not. But government statistics show that 84% of carers across the sector in England were women, and this was in 2012, with 16% being men. And that number has already risen reasonably significantly, given that we've got a care care system. I would say it's a juggernaut. It's not really a system; it's a compliment, isn't it? But we've got a juggernaut which is really under a lot of strain. So with major staffing shortages. So by 2018, I can't get any more recent numbers than that, I'm afraid. The number of men has risen by 2% in the care workforce. So there's not enough staff as it is, but then they're bringing in more men. Now this is a problem because with an aging population and women having a longer life expectancy, there are an increasing number of females needing care. So it's a huge imbalance of the amount of women who are needing care. So we should have a workforce which is predominantly female to cater for these for the females needing care. However, I have noticing with my own eyes there are so many. I see them in their uniforms. Men there's a care home round the corner, or I see them on their bicycles, and I recognise the uniforms because I used to work for these, and it's men, and I was just thinking, where have they come from? So a little bit of digging I realised that well, there's two things that I found interesting. 2012 is the time that figure has raised from 2012 to 2018 by 2%, which is quite a lot, I think. The 2012 was when they brought in the universal credit sanctions. So there's always care jobs. We know that they're understaffed. So universal credit sanctions have come up. So in North Shields, where I live, there's often high levels of unemployment, and there's not many jobs going around, but there's always care jobs. And then there's sanctions if you're not taking jobs that are available. And lo and behold, I'm seeing more men in care. So that's one thing that's, I think, is interesting. But also having a little look on, there was a website called Co-Produce Care. And this was on their website on October 2022. And there's been a massive recruitment drive, which I'd noticed online, for bringing more males into care. When I've just stated that I don't believe that we need more males in care. Really, if male customers, well, vulnerable males need male carers, then the male should be going to them, not to vulnerable women. Anyways, so this website. This is quoting from Nicola Dunn, who's a senior recruitment and retention advisor for Devon County Council. She says, what we found is that men have been particularly difficult to place in domiciliary care. Providers may not have enough hours for men, so they have to try and prepare runs that there are enough service users who are happy to accept a male care worker. She goes on to say, it is quite difficult for us because we have been promoting all sorts of roles to attract all sorts of people in our promotional videos, and our promotional videos and photos include men. But when we get the application, it's hard to place them. So
it's just amazing, isn't it? So it looks like they're going to change. So if they call them women, we can't say no to it.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be creeping in. So so it's clear to me that there's little demand amongst those who require the care for the male carers, yet there's an increased promotion for male recruitment, which is really another folly in the name of EDI, isn't it? The website, however, interprets this very differently from me, of course, and it it insists and highlights that there's a wider need to properly identify the further barriers to driving men into social care, and they call to dismantle gender stereotypes to bring more men into the workforce. But as I've said, there's more women needing care, and we're understaffed. So I don't believe that there should be a drive for more men in care. And I was wondering, why is this the big drive to have the more, sorry, I made a mistake, more men in care? Why is there a big drive to have more men in care? There's this big ideological drive to increase the male workforce, and it's partly the gender thing, but also the men are a really valuable commodity. They always have been in workforces because they don't have babies, and they often don't carry the burden of childcare responsibilities. So they're much more flexible with their hours, and they can work longer hours. And if you've got more people needing care and you're struggling to fill care provider roles, then you've got a man who can go and work all day, doesn't have to pick the kids up from school. He's not going to say no to more hours. And you've got a woman who is going to have to say, who might want to say yes, but can't.
In the 1980s, I worked in London for an organisation, Women's Moves. It was a removal company for women. Being a feminist, I thought, well, I'll do that and stay fit. And anyway, the woman who owns it was a nurse. I think she'd been a lesbian, and then she started going out with this young man, very strong, fit young man. And then she said she'd sent him on a few jobs because Women's Moves, and it was, people would phone up and ask for women removal people, women removers. And we would be meant to be going along. And then she found, and she explained it to me, she said, you know what, Jo, I've just found I make much more money when I send my boyfriend out because he's stronger and he's prepared to go the extra mile, etc., etc. So then what we had to do when we picked up the women, we'd say, yes, Women's Moves, would you mind if a man comes? And then we had to try and persuade them to let the man come. So thinking, that's what's happening now, isn't it? That they can make more money. I mean, I know there's all the other reasons for them doing this, but if they can make so much more money in some cases off men, they're going to try to manipulate us. That sounds, it's horrifying.
Yeah, and I think actually worse than that, worse than manipulate, say, other carers like me, they're manipulating and they're betraying the individuals who are so vulnerable and are actually requiring this care. The CQC has 5 principles of care. Are they safe? Are they effective? Are they caring? Are they responsive to people's needs, and are they well led? Well, I would argue that sending a man would not cover many of those. Are they safe? No, I don't think it's safe. Are they effective? It's not effective if women are not consenting to care from men. Are they caring? Well, absolutely not. It's not caring. It's going against what a woman wants with regards to their dignity and respect. Are they responsive to people's needs? No, it's completely disregarding a woman's needs. Are they well led? No, because if they were well led, these men would be sent to male clients who need the care. So they've gone against all of their 5 core principles of CQC. The CQC also has a number of regulations which you have to comply with. The one that comes up most is Regulation 10, regards to dignity and respect. So this is to go into the thing we were saying about the creeping language of gender. So our Regulation 10, dignity and respect, the guidance on the CQC website says, when providing intimate or personal care, the provider must make every reasonable effort to make sure that they respect preferences about who delivers their care and treatment, such as requesting staff of a specified gender/sex. So yes, first of all, I'll just address make every reasonable effort. Now, in my opinion, there's no reasonable excuse not to provide women-only care in a home care setting. I understand that CQC covers the NHS as well, so you can see why it says it's reasonable, because if you've got an NHS consultant doctor of such and such, you may only have 2 or 3 in the country of that particular specialism, and it might not be reasonable to expect it to be someone of the same sex. And in that case, you would have to, explore how you can come up, maybe have a chaperone or.
Yeah. So because they quite often have people coming in, if you've got a male doctor and you're a woman, a nurse comes in just to check that's what's going on, which I think is great. And you should be allowed to have that, but I guess they can't have that in home care.
If we look at the statistics again, which I know they've got more men in care now, so currently the most recent statistics that I could find would suggest that there's 82% of the domiciliary care workforce is women. So to my mind, maybe I'm stupid, but there should be no reasonable excuse not to provide for those women who have specified, which will be a large amount of women, I'm sure. Some maybe won't mind, but a large amount of women would specify single sex care. And it should be like the norm. They shouldn't even have to specify it. It should just be, okay, well, you're in your own home. Someone needs the key to your house, just so you feel most comfortable with your care and safe. We're not going to send a man round. However, there's several men on our books and we'll send the man to them. Surely that makes sense.
Yeah. And what about campaigning against it? Is there other groups, you're against it, but are the groups of care workers organised, and is there a pushback against all of this?
Not really. I think not. I think that the pushback comes from the people requiring the care. There has been a few cases which have been so you might be aware of the likes of Henrietta Freeman. She speaks very well on Twitter about why she requires single sex care. There was a family who wanted some respite care for their daughter. I think they took it to court actually, and they couldn't get female only care for a young daughter who needed all aspects of intimate care being performed. So they couldn't go on their holidays for any respite. And people who are unofficial carers, they need respite. They really do. So the pushback is coming from the vulnerable people needing care and their advocates, their family advocates, rather than really amongst the caring community. As far as I'm aware, I'm quite an introvert, so I'm not. I absorb information that I see, but I'm not normally someone who joins in very much. So I'm not myself aware. So there may be, and if there are, maybe people can let me know, and that would be great. But one of the so to carry on from this particular part of the regulation 10, dignity and respect. So I've covered the every reasonable effort. It goes on to say they respect preferences about who delivers their care and treatment, such as requesting staff of a specified sex/gender. Now, that's interesting, of course, because many care websites, when they are relating back to the CQC regulations, they have left off the sex and just left it at gender. So they just leave it with that ambiguous term, gender. But the regulation states gender/sex, and within that's in the guidance, but within the regulation, that is pertaining to the Equality Act 2010. So as we know, gender as a protected characteristic, it has to be gender reassignment. So just using the word gender on your website to talk about how you're covering regulation 10 is too ambiguous. Again, it's another reason we really need to get a good clarification in the Equality Act. But more than that, they're deliberately, I think it's a deliberate move to leave off the important word sex, because how many of these men who are the old-fashioned men not wearing wigs or frocks, who are going around to people's homes, how many of them have had a gender reassignment? How many men who do wear frocks and say they're women have had a gender reassignment? I think we're talking very, very small numbers there. So I think it's deliberately ambiguous. When talking about the guidance and how we talk about people who use the service and need care, they call them service users, and I think that's very telling. It's just very dehumanizing. So if you're calling somebody who requires support a service user, it really shows how little they are valued. I mean, the notion of Regulation 9, which is person-centered care, to me, just by calling someone a service user, you've gone against that straight away. I really can't stand it. These are people we're talking about, not users. If you have somebody that you love who is dependent on home care or care in any setting, please find out what the policies are from the care home or the service provider, and please find out who is coming to their homes and when, because you may need to advocate for them. And you can say, if it goes against their consent, they haven't consented to it, if a man provides care, that is assault, and that will scare them, because that's what I had to do. You have to give them the willies, scare them. The Regulation 9 is person-centered care. So it's supposed to be person-centered care, which is based on the needs and assessments of needs and preferences of the individual requiring the care. Now, if you're not getting this and you're being sent a man, for example, apparently they can't prosecute on this. They can just give the care companies a slap on the wrist. However, importantly, there is a Regulation 11, which is the need for consent, which the CQC can prosecute. So, you know, if you are having problems, like I said before, you know, you have to highlight the fact that it's no consent, that's assault. And make sure you say that to any service providers, because otherwise they'll keep sending a man out to you, because it's no skin off their nose to just get looked at by the CQC. They're just a regulatory body. All they'll get is told, oh, you need to improve, or something like that. But if you highlight the issue of consent and that you do not consent, then that's a criminal issue. So yeah, just know your rights as best you can, because we've not got a lot. We need to cling on to it. I had been meaning to write to, I've just been a bit full on at the minute with work, but I want to write to any dementia charities about that recent NHS Confederation guidance that suggested that dementia patients ought to be challenged regarding gender identity. So if anybody is listening and is interested in this, maybe we could come up with like a crib letter, and other people could use it to try and send out letters to dementia charities. I'd be really interested to know what they've got to say about this, because that goes completely against anything I've ever done in dementia training to challenge dementia patients. You just don't do it.
Thank you very much. Hi, Cara. Cara is the president of USA WDI and a lawyer as well, and she is also an author, and she is going to talk to us, give us an update about what's happening in the USA. Over to you, Cara.
I'm here to talk today about updates in the US, which I'm very happy to do, but I prefer to call this why I think we're much further along in the movement to liberate women and girls from gender identity than it might appear. And I thought that the easiest way to understand this might be to start with the basics of how the government is organized, and then go through all the strides that we think we're making in each of them. So this is basically how our government is arranged in the states. We've got the administration under the president, the legislature, which is Congress, consisting of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court and all the courts underneath them. And underneath all of that, we've got 50 state governments plus Washington, D.C. Now, I just assume that most countries are organized in some similar fashion at the national level, and that every country has some form of state or provincial government organization. So as most people know, it's the US Democrats and the political left that is largely driving the gender identity train here. That's absolutely true at the federal level, and only slightly less true at the state level. It's mainly the Biden administration, the Democrats in Congress, and the Democrats in the states who are making life miserable for women and girls throughout the US. Now, of course, I say this as a lifelong Democrat and a leftist myself. And now the courts are supposed to remain apolitical, and I'll get to the judiciary soon. What I want to do here is explain what's been going on in all three branches of the US government and in the states, and why I think we're making more progress than might be obvious. So starting with the administration, on January 20th, 2021, on the very first day of taking office, as Leisha suggested, President Biden issued Executive Order 13988 on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So the executive order begins with this policy statement. Every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. Children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. Adults should be able to earn a living and pursue a vocation, knowing that they will not be fired, demoted, or mistreated because of whom they go home to, or because of how they dress does not conform to sex-based stereotypes. People should be able to access healthcare and secure a roof over their heads without being subjected to sex discrimination. All persons should receive equal treatment under the law, no matter their gender identity or sexual orientation. So this policy statement is, in my view, in some ways completely straightforward and obvious, and in some ways really annoying. The statements, every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love, and children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports seem entirely innocuous. Probably everyone agrees with those statements. I highlighted two phrases in the policy statement here because how they dress does not conform to sex-based stereotypes and, quote, gender identity. Now, I think probably everyone agrees with the statement, adults should be able to earn a living and pursue a vocation, knowing that they will not be fired, demoted, or mistreated because of whom they go home to, or because how they dress does not conform to sex-based stereotypes. In fact, that is already settled law in the states. The Supreme Court already said this in a case called Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins back in 1989. In that case, a woman named Ann Hopkins was discriminated against at work because she refused to conform to her male colleagues' expectations of femininity, and the Supreme Court rightly decided that was illegal. In other words, this aspect of the policy statement was totally unnecessary. But the other thing that's interesting is that the order does not itself define the words gender identity at all, other than this very oblique reference to nonconformity with sex stereotypes. Now, if gender identity means nonconformity with sex stereotypes, we can all relax and go home. Most people don't care if people deviate from sex stereotypes, but as we have learned, that's not what this is all about. The order continues. Okay, these principles are reflected in the Constitution, which promises equal protection of the laws. These principles are also enshrined in our nation's anti-discrimination laws, among them Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In Bostock versus Clayton County, the Supreme Court held that Title VII's prohibition on discrimination because of sex covers discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. Under Bostock's reasoning, laws that prohibit sex discrimination, including Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, the Fair Housing Act, and Section 412 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, along with their respective implementing regulations, prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation, etc. Now, to understand what the administration is doing here, you have to know a little bit about Bostock. That case was originally 3 cases. 2 of the cases involved gay men who had been fired from their jobs because of their sexual orientation. The 3rd case involved a man named Amy Stevens who had been fired from his job because he claimed to be a woman. The 3 cases got joined together, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled that employers can't discriminate against employees on the basis of either sexual orientation or transgender status. Now, to be clear, I hate the Bostock decision in large part because in deciding that people can't be fired because of their transgender status, the Supreme Court said nothing about what transgender status means, not a word. The court simply assumed that transgender status is a coherent descriptor of a person. But as much as I hate the Bostock decision, what I hate even more is what the Biden administration said about it in this executive order. It said that the Bostock decision means that no one is allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of gender identity. But the Bostock decision literally did not do this. I have read the decision countless times, searching for some place where the Supreme Court might have said this. It didn't. In fact, the Supreme Court doesn't even mention the words gender identity, other than in a single footnote citing an outside source. The other thing that's really annoying about this order is its extension of the Bostock decision outside of the employment context. In the decision itself, the Supreme Court expressly stated that its ruling was limited exclusively to the employment context. So when the Biden administration says that the Bostock decision prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity and that its reasoning applies outside the employment context, it's just lying. The order then went on to require US federal agencies to review all of their policies that pertain to sex and rewrite them to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity. Sadly, throughout the first 6 months of 2021, federal agencies went on to do just that. The US Departments of Education, Justice, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, and others all went on to issue various memos and guidance documents that shredded the material reality of sex for purposes of federal administrative law. I'll explain the status of those various memos and guidance documents when I get to the part about the judiciary. But for now, I want to say two things about why I think all hope is not lost for women and girls with respect to federal administrative law, notwithstanding this horrific executive order from 2021. In June of 2022, the Department of Education issued a proposed rule regarding Title IX, which concerns discrimination against women and girls in education, including in sports. The June 2022 proposed rule would have, consistent with the executive order, completely redefined sex to include gender identity for all Title IX purposes. But the American public pushed back hard. The department received over 200,000 public comments to that proposed rule, more than any comments on any proposed rule in department history. Our chapter provided a template for our signatories and supporters to use in submitting comments, as did the Women's Liberation Front. And by May of 2023, the Department of Education had changed its tune. That month, it issued a new proposed rule that appears to have scrapped the idea of redefining sex out of existence. The new proposed rule would allow gender identity to override sex in certain cases, which is bad, but the department appears to have walked back the idea of completely getting rid of the material reality of sex. Whatever Biden might be saying publicly, his own Department of Education is getting the point that Americans don't like what he's doing with respect to gender identity. I count that as a win for women and girls. There's one additional item with respect to the administration that I think is significant. In January 2022, the US Bureau of Prisons, which is in the Department of Justice, updated its transgender offender manual. This is the policy guiding which male prisoners in federal prisons get to be housed in the women's prison on the basis of their claimed woman identities. Now, this was a full year after Biden issued Executive Order 13988. The Bureau of Prisons, in other words, had a full year to figure out how to let male prisoners self-ID into the federal women's prison. It didn't do that. To be clear, this transgender offender manual isn't good because it allows some men to be housed with women on the basis of their claimed woman identities, but it does so on a case-by-case basis. We should, of course, oppose this, and we do. But the fact that the Bureau of Prisons came out with a new policy a full year after the Biden executive order, declining to completely redefine sex to include gender identity, even though that's what the executive order told it to do, strikes me as significant. The main thing to focus on with respect to Congress here is the Equality Act, also known as the bane of feminists' existence since 2015. So I need to say at the outset that this bill is not like other legislation that exists in other countries that enshrines some form of gender in the law. As mentioned, for example, the UK Equality Act protects gender recognition as a category, but it also protects sex as a distinct category. I understand that there has been some debate of late about what the word sex means in the UK Equality Act. But my point here is just to acknowledge that sex, however defined, exists as a standalone category in the UK. My understanding is that Canada does something similar. I don't like any of these laws that protect gender in any of its forms. But this US bill, if enacted, would completely redefine sex out of existence for pretty much all purposes under US civil rights law, including education, housing, and public accommodations like toilets and changing rooms. In my view, protecting gender as a category while also protecting sex as a category is bad, but it's slightly less bad than redefining sex out of existence, which is what the US bill would do, which would be a complete disaster for women and girls. The other thing to know is that as bad as Biden's executive order is, this bill is much worse because it reaches much farther. The president has some limited authority under the US Constitution, and his order only reaches federal administrative agencies. Congress has the authority to do much more damage. So this is how Congress summarizes the bill. This bill prohibits discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity in areas including public accommodations and facilities, education, federal funding, employment, housing, credit, and the jury system. Specifically, the bill defines and includes sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity among the prohibited categories of discrimination or segregation. The bill also allows the Department of Justice to intervene in equal protection actions in federal court on account of sexual orientation or gender identity. The bill prohibits an individual from being denied access to a shared facility, including a restroom, a locker room, and a dressing room that is in accordance with the individual's gender identity. So Congress knows exactly what it's doing here. So this is how the bill defines gender identity. The term gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, or other gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth. And we can all probably see what's wrong with that. So I'll leave that there for now, because all we really need to know about the bill itself for the present discussion is that it would obliterate women and girls as a sex class all over the US and for virtually all purposes. It's that bad. What I really want to focus on here is the politics surrounding the enactment of the bill, or more accurately, Congress's failure to enact it and all the work that the US chapter of WDI has done to stop it. Okay, this guy is named Charles Schumer. He's the majority leader of the US Senate, making him the most powerful member of Congress. I would argue that he's actually the most powerful person in the US government because Congress has much more authority than the president by constitutional design. So even though many people have never seen or heard of him, he's the guy calling the shots, and he's a Democrat. As mentioned, this bill has been around since 2015. It has passed in the House of Representatives twice. It has never gotten to a vote before the full Senate. It most recently passed the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives in February 2021. When that happened, it is not an exaggeration to say that US feminists went into a near panic. President Biden had vowed to get the bill passed within 100 days of taking office, and we were very worried that he would succeed. At that time, both chambers of Congress were controlled by Democrats. The bill very quickly went to the Senate, and it was scheduled to be heard before the Senate Judiciary Committee in March. We quickly took action. The US chapter of WDI had several meetings with a senior staffer in Schumer's office. She seemed to be somewhat sympathetic to our arguments. We then submitted written testimony before the hearing was to take place. In our testimony, we made three basic arguments. One, the nation hasn't had the conversation we need to have before enacting this legislation. Two, men aren't women, even if they say they are. And three, children are being harmed at the altar of gender identity. I submitted the testimony via email, and I received written confirmation that it was received by every member of the committee. We also sent a separate letter to Majority Leader Schumer. That letter had been circulated by WDI globally, and it was signed by thousands of women all over the world. We're deeply grateful to WDI for circulating the letter and to all the women who signed it. So the bill passed in the Senate Judiciary Committee in March 2021. From there, it should have gone to the full Senate for a vote. But then something interesting happened. Nothing. That was March of 2021. 100 days from Biden taking office would have been sometime in late April or early May of 2021. Majority Leader Schumer had the authority and plenty of time to bring the bill before the full Senate for a vote at any time after it passed in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the bill most likely would have sailed through. He didn't do it. Not only did the bill not pass within the first 100 days of Biden taking office, it didn't pass at all in 2021. We kept the pressure on. In January 2022, thanks to a donation from a very generous donor, we sent a copy of my book, The Abolition of Sex, to every member of the US Congress. We also developed an alternative to the Equality Act, which we called the Equality for All Act. The primary author of that bill was US country contact Carrie Bruss. We drafted it in 2021. That bill would protect women and girls on the basis of sex, lesbians, gay men, and bisexual people on the basis of sexual orientation, and everyone on the basis of nonconformity with sex stereotypes. Every month throughout 2022, we encouraged US signatories to send a copy of the bill to their House members and senators. As 2022 wore on, we became a bit mystified that Schumer wasn't taking action on the Equality Act. And finally, by the end of 2022, the bill appeared to be dead. So what happened? You may remember that I referenced the Department of Education's 2022 proposal to redefine sex out of existence for Title IX purposes. The last day to comment on that proposal was September 12th, 2022. On that day, a group of Senate Democrats sent a letter to the department praising their proposal to redefine sex out of existence. There's nothing unusual about that. But what was unusual was that that letter was signed by 19 Senate Democrats. There are 50 Democrats in the US Senate. If 19 of them signed that letter, that means that 31 didn't. By September 22, in other words, fewer than half of US Senate Democrats were willing to put their names on a public letter encouraging the Department of Education to redefine sex out of existence. What might that say about their views on the Equality Act? And did our relentless advocacy have anything to do with it? What's more, the US Senate did pass a different bill in November 22 called the Respect for Marriage Act, and it protects the legal marriages of same-sex couples. 12 Senate Republicans even signed that bill, among them some of the most conservative Republicans in the country. My question is this: if Majority Leader Schumer could get so many senators to support marriage equality, which is a good thing, why couldn't he get similar support for gender identity? Earlier this year, we declared the Equality Act to be dead. In doing so, we said that we're not out of the woods yet because a member of Congress could bring it back. But we said we didn't think that would happen because we didn't think the Democrats in Congress were stupid enough to do that. The death of the Equality Act should have been a major embarrassment for the president, who not only could not get the bill passed within 100 days of taking office as promised, but couldn't get it passed within 2 years of taking office. Well, it turns out we were wrong, and some Democrats are stupid enough to bring the bill back. It came back this past month. But interestingly, it only has 4 sponsors. And as far as I can tell, Schumer hasn't said a word in support of it. I was recently talking with a friend who knows a lot about the inner workings of Congress. She agrees that the Democrats are idiots for bringing the bill back and that it has no chance of going anywhere. It won't get a hearing in the House of Representatives because that body is now run by Republicans. She thinks the Democrats aren't quite stupid enough to bring it to a hearing in the Senate. Having embarrassed the president once by failing to get the bill passed during the first 2 years of his administration, they probably aren't stupid enough to do it again, but who knows? I'm happy to report that I'll be meeting this coming Friday with some friends about how to get me a shot at testifying against the bill if it does get a hearing. I hope the bill does not get a hearing because I want this bill to die a final death. But on the other hand, I kind of hope that it does get a hearing because I would relish the opportunity to tell the Democrats in Congress exactly what I think about their stupid bill live and on camera. The president likes to blather on about getting the Equality Act passed in his State of the Union addresses and elsewhere, but the president likes to blather on about lots of things. Regardless of what he's saying in public, the situation looks very different on the ground. One last thing to say about the Equality Act. One reason it is so astonishing that it hasn't passed is because of the support behind it. This bill has the strong support of not only the Human Rights Campaign, but also of HRC's coalition of more than 500 major corporations. HRC literally put this coalition together for the specific purpose of getting this particular bill passed. The coalition includes some of the richest and most powerful corporations in the world, including Amazon, Apple, Bank of America, Capital One Financial Corporation, and Comcast. This is what we've been up against this entire time. We, radical feminists, mostly volunteer and poorly funded, with no political power and no public face whatsoever, have been up against some of the richest and most powerful institutions in society, and somehow, miraculously, we're not dead yet. As mentioned, the Supreme Court decided in Bostock versus Clayton County in 2020, and the Biden administration has been using it to shred women's rights since taking office in 2021 with a slew of executive orders, memos, and guidance documents that tell federal agencies to redefine sex to include gender identity for nearly all purposes under federal administrative law. I'm happy to report that Biden's efforts to shred women's rights aren't going very well for him in the US courts. In 2022, a federal court in Tennessee said that all the orders, memos, and guidance documents were invalid because the administration had failed to follow applicable procedural law and blocked them from taking effect in 20 states. That's good, and that matter is currently on appeal. The US chapter of WDI had filed a friend of the court brief in the district court in that case, and the Women's Liberation Front filed a friend of the court brief on appeal. We think these briefs are making a difference. This year, a federal court in Texas ruled that one particular Biden memo was substantively flawed as well. One of the Biden memos concerned the Affordable Care Act, and it said that medical practitioners who receive funding under the act aren't allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of their gender identities. In this particular case, a doctor had a male patient, and the doctor was concerned that his male patient might have prostate cancer. He wanted to refer the patient for prostate cancer testing. But the male patient said, basically, I identify as a woman, therefore I do not have a prostate, therefore I cannot have prostate cancer, and refused treatment. Literally. But the doctor received federal funding under the act, so he was worried that referring the man for prostate cancer testing would constitute unlawful gender identity discrimination. So he felt he was unable to provide proper treatment to his patient under the Biden order. So he and some other doctors challenged the Biden administration's guidance on this, and the court agreed, ruling that sex means sex under the Affordable Care Act and that doctors can provide sex-appropriate treatment. That's good. But there's a reason it's even better, which is that the Affordable Care Act defines sex by reference to Title IX. That means that this court also ruled that sex means sex under Title IX, which is great for our purposes. That matter is also on appeal, and we filed a friend of the court brief there too. There are just a few other cases. Is it okay if I go a little bit over, Joe?
Yeah, yes, it is.
I won't go much over. There are a few other cases worth mentioning, even though they don't involve the Biden administration. In one, a panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a beauty pageant that limits participation to women is allowed to exclude men, including men who claim to have woman identities. Probably no one here today likes beauty pageants. I know that I don't, but that's not the point here. The point here is that this is a strong indication that women's organizations can legally exclude men, including men who claim to have woman identities. The Women's Liberation Front had filed a friend of the court brief in that case, and it was cited in the court's opinion, which is amazing. In another case, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that schools are allowed to maintain single-sex bathrooms. That's really good. But what's really amazing about that case is that the losing party, a woman who wanted to use the men's bathroom on the basis of her claimed man identity, was represented by Lambda Legal, an organization so corrupted by gender identity that it may as well be the ACLU. Lambda Legal chose not to petition the Supreme Court to review the decision, which is huge because it suggests that Lambda Legal knows it's losing. The Women's Liberation Front had also filed a friend of the court brief in that case back in 2018. Finally, there's a case currently pending in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals where a lower court had ruled that states are allowed to maintain single-sex sports. Our chapter has filed a friend of the court brief pending on appeal there too. But the thing that's most astonishing about that case is that the lower court ruling was made by a judge who had been appointed by President Clinton. We can all think whatever we think about President Bill Clinton, but the point here is that to the best of my knowledge, this is the only legal ruling entered by a Democrat-appointed judge that preserves the material reality of sex in a way that benefits women and girls. The only thing left to say is that we're making strides in the states too. Thanks to the volunteer women who make up our state legislative action team, we have submitted countless pieces of written testimony in support of bills to protect women and girls as a sex class, in support of abortion rights, and in opposition to efforts to erase women and girls and/or to harm children. Over the past couple of years, our team has become extremely organized, focused, and fast about analyzing bills, figuring out our positions on them, and writing and submitting testimony. And I'm very happy to report that there are increasing numbers of Democrats who are voting in alignment with our principles at the state level. Although it may not be obvious, we have made huge strides. The Biden administration has so far been unable to persuade either Congress or the courts that it's a good idea to throw women and girls under the bus at the altar of gender identity, and we think we've had a lot to do with that. America is waking up to the horrors of gender identity, and they're not having it. I wanted to just say one last thing about how the media frames this as conservatives, the big bad Christian right, versus a quote marginalized community, because they totally do that all the time. But I have a theory about it, which is it has to do with why we, the feminists, are silenced in the media, but the conservatives are not, right? So our opposition, the Trantifa or the gender, the gender people, I think that they have taken a risk. I think that they think they have a shot at beating the conservatives, but they know they don't have a shot at beating us. And that's why they're so intent to silence us. They don't go after the conservatives. I mean, they whine and complain about the conservatives, but conservatives get a voice in the media and we don't. And there's a reason for that. And I think that the genderists think that they don't have much of a shot of beating us at all if we can be heard. And I think that they're right.